Hello, my name is Kurt Burnham. I'm the president of the High Arctic Institute, which is a conservation research and education nonprofit that works in Greenland. One of the things we do in Greenland is study Gyrfalcons, and myself, I've been around Gyrfalcons my entire life. My father also worked in conservation, and when I was a young boy, several years old, at that point we were actually breeding Gyrfalcons in captivity, just pioneering the technique. And ever since then, I've been around Gyrfalcons. I first started working in Greenland 25 years ago and have been working on Gyrfalcons ever since then, along with peregrine falcons, and now we also work with a number of other species like Atlantic puffins and some water or shorebirds and waterfowl and seabirds and things like that. So I was invited today, though, to talk about Gyrfalcons and answer everyone's questions. So please email in or send in your questions. Question number one is, what is the usual range of the Gyrfalcon? Someone mentioned that they saw one outside of Boulder, Colorado. Well, that's a good question. So Gyrfalcons are the largest of all the falcon species, and Gyrfalcons just occur and breed in the circumpolar Arctic. So by that I'm talking about Alaska, Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Scandinavian countries, and then northern Russia. So that's where they're primarily going to be found breeding, and typically is their actual breeding range. They're typically going to be breeding about no further south than about 58 degrees. Northern latitude. So basically, if we were talking about somewhere like in North America, we're talking about them just breeding in Alaska, the Northwest Territories, Yukon, Nunavut, and then some of the birds in northern Quebec, northern Labrador, and areas like that, and then again in Greenland. So, but now talking about seeing one somewhere like Boulder, so then we're talking about more of the winter months and where are these birds actually going to go to in the winter, because most birds, especially those that are breeding in the Arctic, in the wintertime, they're going to migrate south. So typically, most of the birds that are going to be breeding in the North American Arctic are going to be moving south. Especially those that are in the further north. For example, the bird that we see in the picture, that everyone's seeing in the picture here, that bird's probably from fairly far north in Canada because we see that it's white in color. And typically the white birds like that, Gyrfalcons actually come in typically have three different colors, but there are phases in between, but they'll occur all the way from almost all white to almost all black. But typically the white birds, like we see in the picture, those birds are going to be the ones that breed in the furthest north. So typically those birds are going to be breeding in northern Greenland or in places like Ellesmere Island or some of the other islands in northern Canada. But again, in the wintertime, those birds do move south like that. And so that bird, you could see birds wintering as far south. Colorado, that's extremely far south. That would be a real rarity, but if they do see birds that far south, like around Boulder, if you were to see a bird in the Boulder area, wouldn't be at all uncommon to see a bird like that. Probably around somewhere like a reservoir where there's some open water and a bunch of waterfowl that are congregated together, and that bird's probably taking advantage of all those waterfowl as a food source. More commonly, you might see a few Gyrfalcons in places like North Dakota, Montana, northern Idaho, even northern Washington State. But again, they do get that far south. Moving on to question number two, if the tower in Churchill is its base, how big an area would the falcon have as a territory? Another good question. So to some degree, a Gyrfalcon's territory in the winter is going to be, or to a large degree, the Gyrfalcon's territory in the winter is going to be dependent upon the food supply that's available to it. So I don't know exactly where this tower is located at in Churchill, but it's probably, from what I can tell, it's in a nice wide open area. I do see some trees, but there's a lot of sort of open tundra, so that's going to be an area where that bird's able to go out and hunt. And hopefully find a lot of prey. Again, there could be some open water in that area, and the bird's going out and taking advantage of that. It is coming back to the same location repeatedly, so that is definitely, I would call it, that is its territory, and it is staying right there. And it's probably not going any more than maybe 3 or 4 or 5 miles in a day, going out and hunting and then coming back to that tower. In other areas, though, Gyrfalcons, like some of the research I've done in Greenland, we actually put satellite transmitters on these birds in Greenland. Especially the ones in northern Greenland, because one of the big unknowns was always where do Gyrfalcons that nest in the far north. So when I'm talking, where I work in North Greenland, out of Thule Air Base, if everybody was to go look at a map, and you'd see that's at about 76.5 degrees north. So that's quite a ways north. And those in the wintertime, when you're that far north, it actually gets dark for about 3 months straight. So pretty much all the birds have to migrate and go further south. So our research was actually looking at where these birds that nest in the high Arctic, where they go in the wintertime. And in that case, some of them went to southern Greenland, but when we were working with birds on the east coast of Greenland, we actually found that some of these birds don't actually even really set up winter territories. Some birds actually were out and continuing to move and travel around for the entire winter period. So instead of going and setting up and being in one location all winter, they were actually traveling thousands of miles. And in some cases, we actually had some of these birds that were living out on the edge of the sea ice. So they were actually several hundred miles from land. And as the ice would push down and go further and further south throughout the winter months, those birds were out there living right along that ice edge, probably sitting on icebergs. And you actually end up with a lot of other seabirds and waterfowl that are out there living along that ice edge as well. So those Gyrfalcons were actually out over the ocean, in some cases for up to 30 days straight, just sitting on icebergs, feeding on whatever food they could find out there. So it can vary quite a bit. The size of their winter territory can vary quite a bit. Moving on to question number 3. Are there any times during the day when it's more likely we'll see the Gyrfalcon come to visit the tower? I get the feeling he's sitting behind the camera view while we're watching something else. Well, I would say most definitely. The mornings might be a very good time because, as you can imagine, where they're at there in Churchill, it gets quite cold at night. So when the sun comes up in the morning, where do you think the very first place to see the sunrise is going to be? Well, it's probably going to be the top of that tower. So that would be a great place for that Gyrfalcon to go start its day. As soon as it starts to get light, the Gyrfalcon probably would go up there and sit on the tower, and then that would be the first place that the sun would hit, and that Gyrfalcon would sit there and enjoy just sort of bathing in the sun and warming up to start its day. And again, similarly, it may just sit up there throughout the day, enjoying the view. Again, a nice warm spot. It actually could be looking out. Raptors have very, very keen eyesight, so it actually could be hunting from up there, looking out and looking around, seeing what it's seeing if there are any birds flying around or either, some sort of small mammal on the ground. So let me move down here. Question number 4. I've read that a female frequently begins breeding and laying eggs while the temperature is still below freezing. Do we know anything about how she prevents the eggs from freezing? Well, that's very true. So in some of the more southern areas of the Gyrfalcon's range, they'll actually start laying their eggs in early April. So again, we're talking now at about sort of 58 to 60 degrees south. And then as you move further north, the lay date actually gets pushed back further and further. So if you were talking about birds like where I work at in northern Greenland, those birds frequently aren't going to start laying until the end of April. In some cases, they're not even laying until mid to late May, so much, much later in the year. But yes, they do lay eggs when it's very, very cold out. It's not at all uncommon to come into a Gyrfalcon nest, and you could actually have this Gyrfalcon nest completely covered in snow. And all you'll see is the female Gyrfalcon. All you'll see is her head poking out of the snow, and the rest of her is completely covered in snow. And she's just sitting there incubating those eggs. And Gyrfalcons, they only occur in the Arctic, so they've evolved for tens of thousands of years to live and be in that climate. So that's just sort of how they're suited. How does she prevent the eggs from freezing? Well, that's another good question. So with birds, when they actually incubate their eggs, birds' eggs need to be kept at the exact same body temperature as the adults. So they actually go through and they have what's called a brood patch. If anybody has chickens at home or something like that too, and they start to go what we call broody and incubate their eggs, they'll actually lose all their feathers on each side of their breast. So they'll lose that, and when the birds are actually incubating their eggs, those eggs are actually going to be pressed right against their actual bare skin. So that's how the birds are actually able to keep those eggs warm. And then there's no real problems then. And sometimes the birds will switch out, the male and female. The male will actually come in and incubate, but if it's real cold like that, they may not switch out at all, and she could go days without eating, or when they do switch out, it could take them a matter of 20 or 30 seconds for the female to get off the eggs and the male to move in and start incubating the eggs. Moving on to the next question. How large are their nests and where do they typically nest? How many eggs do they normally lay/hatch? So another good question. So Gyrfalcons don't actually build their own nests. So typically they're going to use nests of things like northern ravens. So some years they'll actually come in and displace ravens that have started to breed, but more frequently the ravens will build a nest and use it one year, and then they won't come back the next year. The raven builds a new nest, and then the Gyrfalcon would come in and use that. And their nests can vary in size, so they could be several feet wide, or just like I say, the size of a raven nest. They will also use things like old eagle's nests, so again, stick nests that other birds build. What's interesting in a lot of places, like where I work in Greenland, some of these nests where the Gyrfalcons are at, they do nest so early in the year and it is so cold that they actually build their nests under these big overhangs on the cliffs. So the nest will be up on a cliff face. Some cases they won't be on that big of cliffs, or some cases it could be 1,000-foot cliff. But typically it'll have this big overhang, so the nest is very, very, very protected. And in those cases, like where we're at in Greenland, and this is unique to Greenland, the birds actually, the Gyrfalcons will come back to these nests time after time. And in some cases, over the years, these nests get quite large because when the Gyrfalcons keep coming back to them, as the young are raised, they deposit all the guano, so feces, in the nest, and that tends to build up. And in some cases, it builds up, and you end up with a nest that could have 3 or 4 feet thick of guano. So extremely thick, and it gets very hard like concrete. And interestingly, in Greenland, we were actually able to go back and core some of these because it is like concrete. You can actually go in and core and get all the way down to where that nest would have started. And we've been able to go back and carbon date that and show that in some cases, the Gyrfalcon nests in Greenland are up to 2,500 years old. And so that Gyrfalcon hasn't been necessarily nesting there every single year, but it is nesting there in most years. So at one point, though, it was just, it was a raven's nest, but the Gyrfalcons started coming to it and coming back, and now we have this nest that's been used for up to 2,500 years. Additionally, we can actually go through and find, using what's called stable isotopes, we can go through and in these samples even try to figure out and look at what their diet was back then, or 2,500 years ago. If they were eating things more like seabirds, or if they were eating more things what we call terrestrial diet, being things like more like maybe waterfowl or Arctic hare and things like that. As far as eggs, Gyrfalcons typically lay 3 to 6 eggs. The most common number is going to be 4. So they lay 4 eggs. In a good year, all of them will hatch. Sometimes only 3 will hatch. It's just hard to tell. As far as actually how many hatch and then actually leave the nest, typically if they hatch 4 net young, it's not all that common for them to actually fledge that many young. And by fledge, that means actually leave the nest. It may only be 2 or 3. And again, a lot of times that's going to really vary by how much food there is in any given year. If you have a year that has really nice, great weather, no rain or things like that, you might have higher productivity or nesting success. If you have a year where there's abundant prey around, again, they might actually be able to fledge and raise more young than in other years. So there's a lot of variability in that. Moving on to number 6, when is nesting season and where do they nest? So I sort of covered that again, and they do start breeding in the more southern areas that they nest in the Arctic. Probably in early April they'll start laying their eggs, and their egg incubation period is going to be about 33 to 35 days, and their eggs are actually going to be about the size of a chicken egg, just a little bit larger than a chicken egg, and they're going to sort of be creamish in color to sort of almost a bit of a real light reddish color, and sometimes they'll have sort of some, for lack of better words, sort of like cinnamon spots on them. Sorry, I go back. And then, so yeah, and again, they're going to be nesting on cliffs. There are a few places where every once in a while Gyrfalcons will have been observed nesting in trees, or by nesting again, using stick nests of other birds that are in trees. Moving on to the next question. Number 7, occasionally we see the Gyrfalcon look at the camera and take an aggressive stance. Do you think he's reacting to his reflection? Yes, I would guess that the Gyrfalcon is, when it's looking into the camera, that it's seeing its reflection. In the wintertime, when the birds do migrate, they're not going to be, especially this time of year, they're not going to be spending time with other Gyrfalcons. They're not going to be an extremely social bird. So if it did see another Gyrfalcon, it would be defensive because that is its territory where it's at. And if another Gyrfalcon was to come into that area, it would probably try to drive that other Gyrfalcon off. Because it wants to have that territory for itself, and because it wants all the food in that territory just for itself and not to share with anyone else. So if it does see another falcon, it would try to drive it away. Question number 8. How large are these birds and how big is their wingspan? So for actual size, one of the interesting things about raptors is we have what's called reverse sexual dimorphism. So if you think about most mammals in general, and in most birds in general, you always think of the male being much larger than the female. But in raptors, it's going to be just the opposite. So in the case of Gyrfalcons, a male Gyrfalcon could weigh anywhere from, we'll probably say 2 to 3 pounds. And then we're actually going to have the female Gyrfalcon, though, is going to weigh anywhere from more like 3 to 4.5 pounds. So she's actually significantly larger. She's actually about 1/3 larger than the male is. And as far as their actual wingspan, the Gyrfalcon's wingspan is going to be, on average, it's about 4 feet wide. So They're the largest of the falcons by quite a bit, with the peregrine falcon being generally the next smallest, and the saker falcon. Question number 9. Is seeing this Gyrfalcon on the cam that surprising, given that the species must be more common in this area? Well, as far as actual numbers of Gyrfalcons, the actual total number of pairs of Gyrfalcons in the entire world would probably be is estimated to be between about 8 and 11,000 pairs. So that may mean somewhere in the range of 30 to 40,000 Gyrfalcons in the world. And I realize that sounds like, me saying that sounds like a huge number, but that's not really that big of a number if you go take out a globe and look at how much Arctic there is. So would I say it is surprising? Yes, I would say it is pretty surprising. I'm sure that they actually see Gyrfalcons in that area, fairly regularly in the wintertime, but to actually have a Gyrfalcon come and sit on that exact tower where that camera is, it's pretty special, pretty cool as a matter of fact. So, question number 10. Is it likely we're seeing the same bird, or could this be a pair? No, from what I can see, this is pairs. In some areas in the more southern latitudes where, again, if you were talking about, well, in this area, there could be some breeding Gyrfalcons in this area, but this bird being a white Gyrfalcon, it's most likely not from that local area. It, again, is probably from much further north. So we're talking as they get older, and they may get a little bit darker, but once they're 2 or 3 years of age, it's not going to really change much. And yes, as far as going back to the actual color gradients again, it is in northern Greenland, you're going to have, in northern Greenland where I work, we have sort of 99% white Gyrfalcons, and we've seen a couple silver Gyrfalcons over the last 25 years. In areas like more southern Greenland, you're going to have dark birds, sort of halfway between north and south. You're going to have about 50% white, 50% silver or gray. But even in that case, the white birds are not going to be nearly as white as the birds further north. The white birds that are further, in some cases that are further south, they're going to have a lot more barring on their back. They could be a white bird that actually has barring on its chest. In Canada, again, typically the birds only the far north in the islands are going to be the white birds. And in Alaska, there's not really that many, there's not going to be all that many white Gyrfalcons in Alaska. Moving on to question number 12. After reading that they are rarely seen, are they endangered? So no, Gyrfalcons are not endangered. They are protected at this point, but they are not endangered. There's a lot of research now going into them, though, about what are the effects of climate change, what effect is climate change going to have on things like Gyrfalcons. Similar to things like polar bears that only occur in the Arctic, Gyrfalcons are the same. I mean, that's where they breed, that's where they're at. So there's a lot of research and some concern going into what's going to happen with these. We do see other species, for example, peregrine falcons and other species I work with in North Greenland that in the last 50 years, we've seen the peregrine falcon population in Greenland move further north, potentially. Sorry about that. We lost everyone there for a moment, but now we're back. Moving on, my last question was, after number 12, after reading that they are rarely seen, are they endangered? So no, they're not actually, Gyrfalcons are not actually endangered. As I was saying before, they are a species of concern at this point, with everything you see in the news now about climate change and how the northern climates are changing. Being an Arctic specialist that only breeds there, they are one of the birds that there should be a lot of concern for, especially when they're at the very top of the food chain. So again, they're going to be or top of the food pyramid. They would be a bird that you might expect to actually start to see a decrease in population first if climate change is affecting them in one way or another. In North Greenland, where I work, one thing we are seeing is now peregrine falcons, their population is actually moving further north. And that's been seen throughout North America and even in Europe with a warming climate, that a number of bird species are actually extending their northern breeding range further and further north. And so as these things like in northern Greenland, as the peregrine falcons move further north, they are starting to come into direct conflict with Gyrfalcons, one for nesting locations and two also for prey. So they could be, they're a good species to study at this point and to have some concern with. And as I mentioned earlier, even in the wintertime with these Gyrfalcons out using the sea ice, and having territories actually out over the sea ice, like polar bears, Gyrfalcons could actually be affected if we do start to see a big decrease in the amount of sea ice. Moving on to the next question, number 13. Around Churchill, would ptarmigan be the Gyrfalcon's main food supply? And if so, how is the ptarmigan population coping with the Arctic warming trend? I'm not extremely familiar with Churchill. As far as actual what prey Gyrfalcons are going to be taking, they are primarily they're going to be feeding on ptarmigan, and ptarmigan is the single most important food source for Gyrfalcons. You might ask why. Well, if you think about when these Gyrfalcons actually arrive in the Arctic and actually start breeding, they're actually the very first bird to breed in the Arctic. So when they actually arrive back on their winter ranges, or those birds that in the further south that actually stay in their nesting area over winter, ptarmigan is really going to be the only food source that's available to them when they want to start nesting and start laying eggs. So that's why the ptarmigan are so critical. In other areas, though, they do feed on things like ground squirrels. They will feed on things like lemmings. There's something called a leveret, which is going to be a juvenile Arctic hare. They also eat those. They'll also take waterfowl, a lot of seabirds, a lot of shorebirds. They will even eat some different songbirds. So to some degree, while ptarmigan is by far and away the most important, they can really branch out and take a very wide and diverse number of prey. In one place, they were even found that they were eating Arctic fox pups, and they brought in, I don't know, it was 4 or 5 Arctic fox pups over the summer, and that was one of their prey items. So, how are the ptarmigan population actually coping with the Arctic warming trend? At this point, I don't know that much about ptarmigan. In a lot of places, ptarmigan populations are very high, so they're quite easy to study. Where I work in Greenland, the ptarmigan population is quite low. When I'm there nowadays I'm in Greenland now for 4 to 6 weeks each summer, and I probably see a ptarmigan every 3 or 4 years at most. So, moving on to question number 14. Where does the Gyrfalcon roost overnight or for shelter? Again, the Gyrfalcon probably has a cliff face somewhere around that area where that tower is at that it's nesting on. I mean, it could, on a nice night, it very well could roost on that tower the entire night. A lot of the places where Gyrfalcons winter, I mean, they're used to extremely cold weather. I mean, in some places it's going to easily be -20, -30, even -40 below, so they can actually have the ability to take that. Having evolved to live in the Arctic, they actually have feathers come down most of their legs compared to other falcons. That wouldn't be the case, but especially if you look at, there was a flying picture on the posted at some point on explore.org, and you can actually see the feathers coming almost all the way down to the foot. So I mean, they really can stay out and be in areas that are extremely cold. They have the ability to put on a lot of extra weight. I mean, almost a quarter or a fifth of their body weight in the wintertime actually could just be fat that they put on and built up. So they're actually, if they have a really bad storm for 3 or 4 days, they can go without eating and just sit there and hunker down. But most likely, especially if there is bad weather, they are going to try to go out somewhere and probably find a cliff face and try to find somewhere that's overhung that they can tuck back in. Or if the wind's coming out of a certain direction, they're going to want to get in a location where they're not going to be directly in the wind and they can actually find some shelter from the wind. Moving on to question 15. What is it about these birds in particular that allows them to tolerate such extreme temps? Well, I sort of just talked about that then. Another part of it is, again, they have they have the feathers that come most of the way down their legs, so when they actually sit, those feathers coming down that low, they're actually going to be able to, when they sit, their feathers are actually going to cover their feet too then, so their feet aren't exposed to the bare, aren't bare at that point. They're going to actually be insulated. And also, like, if you were to hold different birds, holding a Gyrfalcon is really unique because underneath all of their outer feathers, you're actually going to be able to have, there's a huge amount of down. So it's almost like a down comforter that they're wearing. So that's one of the ways that they're actually able to really take advantage of and live in these cold conditions. Additionally, I talked about how they're able to fatten up and have so much fat going into the winter months to where that if they need to, they can live off of that. Also, they have the ability to have a huge crop. So birds have if you see a bird, sometimes you'll see a bird with a normal front on it, and sometimes you might see a picture of a bird that has like a big bulge right there, like a baseball in it, and that's going to be their crop. And so Gyrfalcons, again, they could actually store a huge amount of food in their crop, enough food could be stored in their crop that they could actually go for a day or two without eating and probably wouldn't even get hungry at that point, wouldn't even be starting to use their fat reserves and breaking down their fat reserves in their body. Question number 16. What protects a bird's eye from snow blindness in areas such as these? So typically, if it's going to be that snowy, the Gyrfalcon is not going to be outside. I mean, they would just actually shut their eyes at that point. They're not going to be out. They're not going to be out flying and hunting in a really bad snowstorm because, again, they're going to have very limited visibility. So if it is that bad and things like snow blindness, they're going to actually be tucked in somewhere safe with their head down, just trying to stay warm and stay out of the wind. Question number 17. Has a Gyrfalcon ever been tagged and monitored? Well, that was actually a lot of what my research was when I did my PhD. And again, we were tagging Gyrfalcons in Greenland, and we used this thing that's called a PTT, or Platform Transmitter Terminal. I wish I had one here. There's a really small unit. It's actually a backpack unit that you mount on the bird, and it has an antenna that sticks up. And this small unit actually then broadcasts, sends out a signal every 2 to 3 days, depending upon how you programmed it. And a satellite picks up that signal, and then it sends it to me and tells me where that bird is on the face of the earth. And so for about 5 years, I did a lot of research in northern Greenland, and then or northwest Greenland, and on the east coast of Greenland, and even in southwest Greenland. Doing that and looking at where these birds are moving, because that really, especially for these high Arctic populations that are so hard to study because temperatures are so extreme, and these birds in general are in very, very remote places. I mean, in most cases, they're where humans rarely ever go. So the only way to really monitor and look at where these birds are going in the wintertime is using something like that, especially if you're talking about, as I found, that these birds are actually out over some of these birds are actually out over the sea ice in the winter. You couldn't really be out there unless you were in an icebreaker, and then it would just be sort of random luck if you were ever to actually run into one of them. So yes, they have been monitored and tagged that way, and then we'd be able to look and see where they're going in the wintertime and what their movement patterns are. We'd also then get an idea of how large their breeding home range is, so how many square miles they might be using to nest in the summertime. Moving on to the next question. Number 18. Don't these birds prefer mountains to flat terrain? Well, they don't. Typically, you're going to find Gyrfalcons nesting. Their most ideal places are going to be. They're almost always going to be on cliffs, and a lot of the times they're going to be along rivers or on coastline, because those are great spots with cliffs. They're going to want to have a pretty good view. Excuse me. And so most of the time when they are hunting ptarmigan, if you think about where ptarmigan are at, ptarmigan aren't really in mountains necessarily. They're going to be more out in tundra area or flat tundra ranges. So that's a little bit easier. When you're out in a generally flat area, a bird can see really a long ways, which makes it a lot easier to hunt. Because again, with their really keen eyesight, they can see that far, and they can pick things out and pick out the small movements on the tundra. So no, generally they're going to be in areas that are somewhat flat in terrain. But again, they are in mountains. But like I said, along coastlines, along rivers, along streams, anywhere you're going to find cliffs like that, that's going to be the most likely place that you're going to find them. And again, it depends upon what your definition of mountains is. I mean, these are areas that we're talking about. You're going to be going up hills, and there could be 1,000 feet of elevation or more in some spots. Moving on to question number 19. Does the Gyrfalcon have any natural predators? Generally speaking, Gyrfalcons don't actually have that many natural predators. Especially in most places that they occur in the far north, they're going to be, again, at the very top of the food chain. I mean, as far as adult Gyrfalcons, they're really not going to have many predators. The only time that a Gyrfalcon is really going to be susceptible is going to be when they're chicks. So when they first come out of the egg and they're in the nest, and typically the female is going to stay around the nest that time and provide protection for those chicks. Because if she does leave, you could have things like ravens, which would come in and actually then grab the young Gyrfalcon chicks and rob the nest. Where I work in northern Greenland, you could also have things like there's a predator called a glaucous gull, which is a very, very large gull, which is very opportunistic. And if it was to fly by a Gyrfalcon nest and see eggs that were unattended or small chicks that were unattended, it would immediately, I'm sure, fly down there and grab those eggs or chicks and eat them or fly off with them and go somewhere else. But otherwise, no, there's no real natural predator for Gyrfalcons in the wild. That said, in the wintertime, if Gyrfalcons are moving further south, like into the northern U.S. or areas like that, you do have golden eagles. Golden eagles could be a predator for Gyrfalcons. Typically, though, it would be if a Gyrfalcon was to catch something and was out eating something like a ptarmigan or an Arctic hare and was eating it on the ground, and something like a golden eagle saw it, it would very likely try to come in and steal the food, or probably in the process of stealing the food would probably catch the Gyrfalcon and kill it and eat what the Gyrfalcon was feeding on. Moving on to question number 20. Do Gyrfalcons stay solitary until the breeding season? So generally speaking, Gyrfalcons are solitary. They'll arrive at their nests again in early spring, and at that point the male and the female will hopefully both return to the same nest. In most cases, you're probably going to have the same male and female breed together every year and come back to generally the same nest or the same general area. Although if one bird was to die, they will readily take up another mate. Or if they were to fail or something like that, if in one particular year they failed and didn't produce young, they may choose to switch up and go find another mate. Sorry here. Otherwise, though, yeah, they're going to generally be solitary. In the very early fall, at certain areas like some of the areas I work in, we have large seabird colonies. You will get some large congregations of juvenile Gyrfalcons, so birds that have only been out of the nest for, say, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. And in some cases, you could end up with like 10 or 15 juvenile Gyrfalcons that are all in one general area because they're all taking advantage of the same food source. But after a few weeks, and once those birds actually leave and start to go further south on migration, they are going to break up then and no longer be solitary. They're not going to like travel. There's no evidence to show that they travel as a large group or anything like that, or even as small groups. Question number 21. Are there any maps on your website which show the monitored activity? Yes, if you were to go to the High Arctic, www.higharctic.org, which is the High Arctic Institute's website, you would actually have to go to, there are going to be some manuscripts on there. There's actually a paper. I'm trying to think where it would be at. I think there's, without looking at the website here, I think it's under publications. You could go find that publication. There should be a PDF of it, and you could download it, and it'll actually show you, there will be some different maps that show you where the Gyrfalcons were at during the winter time, or at least the ones that we tagged in Greenland. Question number 22. Are there things we should be looking for during the Gyrfalcons visits that you would be interested in knowing? At this point, there's probably not that much that would be interesting. I mean, it's more than anything, it's just amazing to actually see a Gyrfalcon on a camera. I mean, if you were to go on the internet, you're going to see peregrine falcons and ospreys and a lot of other things that do end up at places where there are cameras. But no, I think everybody should just really enjoy this. It's a rare opportunity. I mean, it may be something that hardly ever happens again. Having Gyrfalcons wintering in an area. Yeah, I mean, it's fairly amazing just having Gyrfalcon wintering in an area and happening to be using this exact same tower that this camera is mounted on. I mean, it's very much the kind of thing that may very likely never happen again. I mean, Gyrfalcons typically are breeding in areas where you could be tens of miles from humans, or just the same, you could be 1,000 miles from humans, and just having this opportunity, people should enjoy it. But no, as far as a scientific standpoint, there's not that much that we can really learn from it, unfortunately. Moving on to question number 23. Can a Gyrfalcon divert blood to their body surface to aid staying warm? There's not all that much research that's at this point that's actually gone into looking at the actual physiology of Gyrfalcons. As far as actually diverting blood to their body surface to aid in staying warm, no, that's not really going to happen, or that would be extremely unlikely for something like that to happen. There are some people that think that Gyrfalcons, and there needs to be more research done on this, but there are some that think Gyrfalcons have the ability to actually lower their body temperature by a few degrees in the wintertime, especially in times like, again, if it was extremely stormy and a bird just has to sit on a cliff for 3 or 4 or 5 days, that they would actually be able to potentially lower their heart rate, and in that case it would sort of slow down their metabolism to where the food that is in their system would last much longer, and that their fat reserves then would also last much longer. But again, this is just some people that have, some various people have this idea and think this may be what's occurring, but at this point it's an area that there does need to be more research into. But again, it's very hard to study Gyrfalcons, and you really need birds in captivity to do something like that. So, moving on to question number 24. Will they only eat live prey apart from a cache while nesting? Yes, Gyrfalcons would only eat live prey. They're not going to be out. They're not going to take carrion. So carrion's dead things like what vultures eat. No, Gyrfalcons are only going to go out and catch live prey. Again, they do during the breeding season. They are going to actually cache some prey. So the male Gyrfalcon might go out and hunt, and he might come back to the cliff face, and maybe the chicks are full or the female's full and doesn't need to eat at that point, and they might actually go and cache or hide that food item somewhere on that cliff cliff face, go in and stick it behind a rock, and then later on in the day when they get hungry, they might come back and take that out and eat it, or take it out and go feed it to their chicks. But as far as actually out hunting, no, they're only going to be taking live prey. Question number 25, how long do chicks stay in the nest? So as we talked about earlier, Gyrfalcon, the actual incubation period is anywhere from about 33 to 35 days. Once Gyrfalcons hatch, then they're going to be in the nest for about 45 to 50 days. In the first 5 days that they're in the nest, from day 1 to day 5, they should roughly double in size as far as weight at that period. Once they're about 2 weeks old, they'll actually start growing in their actual flight feathers. So for the first 2 to 3 weeks, they're just going to have down on them and be covered in down, and then they are going to start growing in those flight feathers. And then once they're about 40 days old, most of their down's going to be gone, and they'll be primarily covered in their actual flight feathers with a little bit of down sticking out here and there. And again, earlier we talked about reverse sexual dimorphism, that the males are actually smaller than the females. And so interestingly then, when the birds actually leave the nest, it's going to be the males that actually leave the nest first, and they're going to probably leave the nest at about 45 days of age, 45 to 47 days of age, and the female chicks will actually then leave the nest and start flying more at like 47 to 50 days of age. And you might ask, well, why do they leave nest at different times? Well, at this point, the females are going to be a lot bigger than the little male chicks, and the females can get very aggressive, and it can be very difficult when the adult brings food into the nest. At that point, the adult's not going to be feeding each chick. They're probably just going to be sort of flying into the nest and throwing a ptarmigan or some sort of small seabird into the nest, and those large female chicks are going to be very aggressive. So at that point, it's really good for those young males to get out of the nest and be able to go get fed on the cliff face by the adults instead of having to share the nest with the young females. So, question number 26. And I think we're going to actually repeat one here, but a few people missed it. It's, I wonder if you know if we're seeing the same Gyrfalcon here on this cam, or are there more than one? So no, I think you are seeing the same Gyrfalcon time and time again. It always, if you were to look at the bird, it looks, it looks identical every time it's coming in. I do think it's an adult male Gyrfalcon. And again, the way you can tell adults from juveniles is that if you were actually to look at the bars on it, or the pattern that's on the bird, they're very distinct, sort of teardrop shaped or barred. And if you look at them, there's a nice solid edge to them. If it was a juvenile, those spots would actually be more streaked, and they wouldn't have the real distinct edge like you see now. And also when you see, one thing that most people are probably really surprised by, or if you look at its feet, they're bright, vibrant yellow, along with the cere, which is again the part where the beak connects into the rest of the head, and the eyes have bright yellow around them. And again, that's going to be something only the adults are going to have, that real bright, vibrant yellow like that. Juveniles are going to be more gray or blue. And even in the adults, the adult males are going to be the ones that have the actual brightest bright yellow. And that's what makes me, one of the reasons that it makes me think it's an adult male. Also, just simply the size makes me think it's an adult male. Question number 27. What is a Gyrfalcon's life expectancy? So the oldest Gyrfalcon in the wild, I want to say, was recorded about 12 or 13 years old, but that would be extremely, extremely old. Probably of the chicks that actually hatch and leave the nest or fledge the nest, probably well over 50% of those die before they're actually a year old. So first year mortality is going to be extremely high, probably 50, maybe even 60% in these birds. And so to actually have a bird that lives to be 10 or 12 years old in the wild, of every, the odds of that are very, very slim. Maybe of every 100 chicks that fledge the nest, the number that actually live to be 10 or 12 years old, it may be 10, it may be 5 birds. I mean, it's not going to be all that common. It's not going to be all that common. For Gyrfalcons that are in captivity, they are going to be able to live longer. You could have some Gyrfalcons in captivity live to be probably 15 to 18 years old. Once they do reach the end of their life like that, though, they're no longer going to be able to reproduce. They won't lay eggs anymore, or the males won't. Their semen won't be fertile anymore. So we would call them sort of laid out, so they wouldn't be able to reproduce. Question number 28. At what age do Gyrfalcons start to breed? Generally, it's going to be, a lot of research does look at this, it's probably going to be around 3 years of age, although you could see some birds actually start to breed later. But in some cases, you will see birds breed earlier. We've had, where we work in North Greenland, in a single instance, we actually had a bird start breeding when it was only 1 year old. But again, that would be very rare. And you might, in that case, ask, well, how did we know that it was only 1 year old? Well, I just talked about earlier, we can see the distinction between adults and juveniles in their feathers. So when we were actually at the nest, we actually had an opportunity and we caught this adult female that was there, and we put a satellite transmitter or PTT tag on her back so we could follow her. But when we caught her, you could actually see the feathers because she, like I had mentioned earlier, they molt their feathers out every year and get new feathers. And we could actually see she had the old feathers that were in her that were very, very streaked and were more of a cream color. And then in addition to those, she actually had brand new white feathers that were coming in that, again, had very distinct edges. And which was what was telling us that this was actually a bird that was only 1 year old. So, but again, usually it's going to be 2 to 3 years old. Moving on to question number 29. Do Gyrfalcons see the northern lights as we do? I.e., what visible light spectrum do Gyrfalcons see in? That's a good question. Again, I'm not actually sure I can answer that question. What light? And I know actually there is some debate in what visible light spectrum do Gyrfalcons see in. So I can't for sure say whether or not the Gyrfalcons can see the northern lights. Most likely they see some version of the northern lights, whether or not it's exactly what you and I see at home, and the way the lights dance across the sky, I don't know. So sorry. And I think I think at this point we're out of questions. So again, we appreciate everyone tuning in and asking the questions. I've had a great time sharing my passion and love of Gyrfalcons with everyone. If you have any more questions, you're welcome to go to the High Arctic Institute we have a Facebook page that you're welcome to go visit. It has a bunch of pictures of Gyrfalcons there, and it also has a bunch of pictures of other birds that occur in the far north. There are some pretty good videos of Gyrfalcons. There's actually one of it would have been posted a couple years ago, but of a Gyrfalcon that there was 2 juvenile Gyrfalcons that were out over the sea ice, and there was actually not an icebreaker, but a seaworthy ship to be out in the ice that was out there, and they have some great footage of these 2 Gyrfalcon chicks flying around, and they're actually following a polar bear around. So that may be interesting to people if you want to go look at that. On the High Arctic Institute's website, you can also go there, and if you look, there should be a section with photos there, and you should be able to go see some other photos of Gyrfalcons. I don't remember what all's there. There'll be a bunch of good photos of white Gyrfalcons and probably also some gray Gyrfalcons and silver Gyrfalcons from further south in Greenland. So, but yeah, so thank you very much, and everyone have a great evening.